If you've ever had altitude illness, you know how unpleasant it can be and it can end up ruining your trip to the mountains. But what causes altitude illness? Basically, this happens when we ascend too quickly and we start to suffer from the relative lack of oxygen that's at higher elevations. So if you think about when you're at sea level, you've got all that atmospheric pressure weighing down on you. That helps push that oxygen across the capillary membranes out of the lungs into the bloodstream to be delivered throughout the body. As we ascend in altitude, there's less atmospheric pressure. It gets harder and harder and harder for that oxygen to diffuse across that membrane and be delivered throughout your body. So we get altitude illness because we've ascended too rapidly and the body hasn't had a chance to adapt to that relative lack of oxygen, and therefore we become symptomatic and get altitude illness. What are the symptoms? Well, shortness of breath, dizziness, headache, fatigue, lack of appetite, and just a general feeling of unwellness, like you have a hangover. Now, there's 3 different categories of high altitude. By definition, high altitude begins at about 8,000 feet. You know, we get a lot of people though coming to Colorado, landing at about 5,000 feet, a mile high, where they start to get a little bit of altitude illness symptoms. So it doesn't have to officially begin at 8,000 feet. Now, 8 to 12,000 feet is considered high altitude. 12 to 18,000 feet is considered very high altitude. And then above 18,000 feet is extremely high altitude. And this is where supplemental oxygen is almost always necessary. However, there are, of course, many mountaineers that climb the world's highest peaks without using any supplemental oxygen. Now, there are 3 different types of altitude illness, and the first one is AMS, or acute mountain sickness, and this is what we get a lot of in Colorado. Kind of what I just described. You get a headache, you get shortness of breath, fatigue, you just don't feel well. This drives a lot of people into the clinics up in the ski towns and the higher elevation towns. Now, the second type of altitude illness is high altitude pulmonary edema. And this is where fluid begins to collect in the lungs. And of course, this makes it even harder to breathe. This can kind of kick in about 2 or 3 or 4 days after you've been at altitude. So it can kind of sneak up on people. This does happen in Colorado, although it is a lot more rare than just general AMS. The third type of altitude illness is high altitude cerebral edema. This is where the brain begins to swell. This is, of course, a medical emergency. It's life-threatening. These people need to be given a variety of medications and, of course, evacuated from that high altitude as quickly as possible. Very rare here in Colorado, although it does happen once or twice a year to some unlucky people. Now, what can we do to prevent altitude illness? Well, the first thing is acclimatizing. So the definition of acclimatizing is taking your time to get up to altitude. So in a perfect world, you'd come here in Colorado, you'd hang out at one of the towns around 7,000 feet, 8,000 feet, before you went up to the higher towns around 10 or 11,000 feet. Now, that's not always going to happen. So if you can't do that, once you get up to altitude, I would recommend that you rest. Of course, your body's under stress. It's trying to cope with a lack of oxygen. So resting is always a good idea. Of course, hydrating is super important. The higher you go in altitude, the drier the air is. That dry air pulls that water out of your body pretty rapidly. So hydrating is important. Of course, adding electrolytes in is very important because that helps you retain that fluid in the proper compartments, such as your bloodstream, so that you don't get dehydrated. Now, along the lines of not getting dehydrated, avoiding alcohol and excess caffeine is always smart. Those are, of course, diuretics, and those are going to make you lose that water pretty quickly. So if you get up to altitude, try to lay off for a day or two, give your body some time to adapt. Other thing you want to pay attention to is your diet. Increasing your complex carbohydrates, your healthy carbohydrates, because you need that extra energy because, again, your body is working harder to deal with that relative lack of oxygen. And pushing those iron-rich foods is really important as well. We want to support the red blood cells by providing enough iron so they can do their job to deliver that oxygen throughout your body. And then the last things that I would recommend are 2 botanical medicines. There is a traditional Chinese herb known as Cordyceps sinensis. This was used historically among the mountain people in Asia to promote health, promote longevity, and of course, enhance endurance and exercise prowess. Now, interestingly, modern studies show that cordyceps can increase oxygen uptake, thereby supporting exercise and endurance at higher altitudes. So some pretty interesting studies on that one. And then the second herb I would recommend is rhodiola. There's a lot of different species of rhodiola. Many of them have been studied. Again, this is a traditional herb found in the mountainous regions of Asia, used by those cultures to help them adapt to the stressors of high altitude. Now, modern studies with rhodiola also show that it can help increase max VO2 in certain studies. So this again helps support your exercise capacity while you're working out at higher altitudes. And also, rhodiola is an adaptogenic herb, meaning that it helps your body adapt to stressors. So this is part of why these herbs were used in traditional use, is because they help people feel healthier while they were under stress. And there's some interesting studies, again, along those lines that show that rhodiola can help you adapt to different types of stressors, whether they're physical, mental, or emotional. So there you have it. Make sure you take time to acclimatize, make sure you rest, make sure you hydrate with electrolytes, make sure you push those complex carbs and iron-rich foods, and consider using rhodiola and cordyceps maybe a week or two before you get to your high altitude destination so that you can enjoy your time and not get sick. Okay, I hope you enjoyed that video. If you did, please give us a like. Please share this with your mountain buddies or anybody who's planning a trip out to the mountains. And remember to subscribe to our channel.